Hi folks, this is Megan Murray. I'm filling in for Jesse today on the Summer Prevention Webinar Series. Just getting started. All right, so today's webinar is Pornography, Normalizing the Relationship Between Violence and Sex. And as you can see here, just some housekeeping. Our prior topics for this series that we have archived are the gender socialization and sexual violence, integrating an anti-oppression approach in sexual violence prevention, and male engagement and allyship in prevention. Those three are already archived on our website and on our YouTube channel. And just a quick reminder that next week we have our last webinar in this series, which is Teaching Good Sex as a Method for Violence Prevention. Well, today's webinar, we have Amber Morchak, who is a PhD candidate at Washington University. She's going to be discussing research surrounding pornography and sexual violence. All right, so now we're going to pass things over to Amber and let her get started on the presentation.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to switch over to my screen here. When my screen finally pops up, you'll see my cat, Plankton. He's my son. I figured I would give you all a glimpse what he looks like. I'm a diehard cat lady, so of course I would do that. Let's see here. All right, so I just want to give a big thank you to everybody over there at Wisconsin CASA for having me, especially Peter, Megan, and Jesse. You all have been so great. And I want to thank all the listeners for tuning in. A little bit about me. Like I said, I am from Washington State University, so bear with me actually this morning. It's 8 a.m. Out here on the West Coast, so I have my coffee. We should be fine this morning, but keep in mind I'm 2 hours behind y'all. My research here at Washington State really deals with gender-based violence. I look at rape culture, I look at sexual violence, I look at pornography. I examine also institutional corrections, so I have a bit of a variation there. I'm from New York originally, so that will actually help me today because I can talk really fast and get through a lot of material in a reasonably short period of time. I do want to mention, though, my partner, he is actually from Kiel, Wisconsin, up near Manitowoc. I have had a great experience while I've been in Wisconsin. I got a lot of Henning's cheese. I was able to experience some supper clubs, which is definitely unique to Wisconsin, and I also got to see Green Bay and Madison. And my partner tells me that I am now a Packers fan, even though I don't necessarily care about football. He said I have to be a Packers fan if we're ever going to be in Wisconsin. So that's kind of fun. I was kind of looking at who signed up for the webinar today. I noticed there's a lot of university folks, advocates, practitioners, and some other allied professionals here. I'll try to keep all of that in mind as we move forward today. I do have quite a bit of material, as I said, but I'm going to make sure I sort of touch on things that would be relevant to your work, including at the end of the webinar, I'll talk a little bit about how you all can take the information that I present today and deliver it to your constituents, whether that be students or groups of individuals in the community, whomever. You can take some of this and pass it onward if you'd like. So just a bit more about me so you get a better perspective of where I'm coming from. I've had a lot of conversations about this issue, ranging from those with students, practitioners, faculty and staff. I even had the opportunity to do some work in Washington State Department of Corrections, wherein I talked to some male inmates there about cultural norms supportive of sexual violence as well as masculinity, and that was quite a fruitful conversation. Again, this will become really important later when I go over sort of my experiences with presenting this material with a bunch of different individuals and groups, and how you can use my experiences and some of the things that I've learned over the course of doing this work and how to present this material in one of the most effective ways possible. So I also have written quite extensively on the topic. I just submitted a piece actually on incest pornography just recently. I've talked about non-consensual pornography, done some webinars around that. So really a lot of the stuff that I'm chatting about today is rooted in my own research, and then of course I pull in other scholarly data as well. As I mentioned, there is a handout available to you. I have all my references that I've used in this webinar and also other references you might find helpful in your own work. That's right in that PDF. If you'd like any of my publications, if you want to shoot me an email after the presentation, and I'll give you my email address, I can connect you with all of that. Also, I do want to note that I'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. It can become quite the kerfuffle on my end to try to monitor the chat box as we go along through the webinar, so I'll try to tailor all that content, go through all the content, excuse me, as the best I can, and then take your questions towards the end. But I will leave some time for that. And if we don't have time for everyone's questions, or if something comes up later, you can always shoot me an email. I'm super responsive, and we can chat. All right. So now that you know a little bit more about me, let's talk about what I'm going to chat about today. Today I really want to discuss some of the current trends around mainstream porn. I want to talk about how all of those trends and the behaviors and attitudes that those trends shape, how they're all rooted within a rape culture or a culture supportive of sexual violence. I want to talk about a little bit how pornography impacts children and teens, because that's incredibly important, especially for the work that we do, both on college campuses and in secondary ed. And then, like I said, I'm also going to chat a little bit about how you all can take the information back and present it to your constituents. So my ultimate goal here is twofold. I really want to ensure I highlight how violence towards women is not an anomaly within the porn industry, nor in the culture in which we live. We'll discuss all of that. And two, I also want to ensure that you're equipped to go back and talk about the topic, because it can be difficult to have these conversations. Of course, those of us who do this work, we have difficult conversations all the time, and a lot of people may be defensive or unable to have conversations around these issues, but I want to make sure that you all are best equipped to have this conversation. So, I always do disclaimers with any participant groups that I work with, just to sort of give everyone a feel of what we're going to be chatting about and where the perspective that I'm coming from. So I have sort of a unique perspective on pornography. I'm not an anti-porn feminist that believes the industry should be abolished. You know, I think in certain cases, let me just highlight certain cases, it can be sexually empowering on an individual level and gratifying under certain circumstances to engage with pornography. I'm also not anti-pornography because I find it shameful or otherwise sinful. I'm certainly not claiming to be morally superior to anyone else, and I'm certainly not hoping to pathologize anyone in their sexual interests. And I think overall, it wouldn't really matter if I was personally anti-pornography, because it's an ever-expanding multi-billion-dollar industry that people have a vested interest in maintaining. So I kind of take a more, what I feel like is a realistic perspective on pornography, where I can be a critical consumer and researcher with the material, and I can sort of talk about how it permeates our daily lives and how it impacts us both with our attitudes and behaviors. And I just really want to chat for a second, too. The perspective that I'm coming from is I'm focused on mainstream internet pornography that's marketed to heterosexual men. There's so many different genres of pornography and types, but really what I'm looking at is the bulk of the market on these free, large hub websites, which we'll talk about, that are really marketed towards heterosexual men engaging with the content. So I generally expand on those disclaimers if I'm working with students, go a little bit more into detail to sort of preface the information. But for you all, I'm sure most of you are very adept at talking about sexual violence and having these discussions. So that's where I sort of leave it when we're talking with other practitioners and other allied professionals. All right, so let's talk a bit about rape culture and why I feel like it's important that we have a conversation about pornography that's couched in a conversation about rape culture. Rape culture is the infrastructure that enables violence to occur, and it validates it when it happens. It misrepresents sex and gender-based violence as normal and expected. Essentially, rape culture metaphorically drives perpetrators to and away from the scene of the crime. Though and I'm sure you all would agree, it's an individual choice that perpetrators make to engage in sexual violence, to perpetrate sexual violence, but I really feel like rape culture facilitates that violence and lets those who perpetrate it get away with their crimes. So there's a million examples of rape culture I could touch on. I'll touch on a few here. So rape culture is like online news articles about sex trafficking cases, referring to underage victims as, quote, sex workers, and referring to the men who paid sex traffickers to have sex with underage victims as customers. It's flippantly using violent language to discuss sexuality, words like bang, hit, smash. It's a Brazilian soccer player, and I don't know if anybody saw this case, but he got reinstated on his team despite the fact that he was convicted for torturing and murdering his ex-girlfriend. Excuse me. It's rapists being sentenced to 6 months behind bars and only serving 3. It's victim blaming and slut shaming. It's a recent study finding that young girls believe that men's violence is natural, unproblematic, and even romantic. It's boys will be boys, and it's locker room banter. It's in physical spaces and online. It's everywhere. So why is it important to talk about pornography within the context of rape culture? Well, because discussing sexual violence without also discussing pornography is like having a conversation about the obesity epidemic in the United States without discussing fast food. It's not the only factor contributing to it, but it's likely squarely situated on the list. So porn is not just a harmless fantasy, as many people would like to have you believe. It's a sustainable and quantifiable impact on human behavior. The media as a whole has a huge impact on behavior. And if it didn't, then the entire advertising industry would collapse, because it's predicated on the idea that imagery can alter our behavior and consumption patterns. Viewers tend to internalize messaging in mass media. And I think that many people expect me to lay out some sort of linear relationship between porn and violence, like that this specific porn video resulted in another specific act of sexual violence. I don't think it's that simple. I think pornography and rape culture create a way of thinking about sexual violence that minimizes it and normalizes it. In a rape culture, pornography is violent visual pageantry. It's a performative spectacle embellished with over-dramatizations and blatant falsehoods, including that violence is always erotic, and anything erotic is to be degrading, abusive, and violent. In my opinion, if sexual violence had a publicist, it would be pornography. So like many other scholars before me, I believe that pornography is rape culture propaganda, because we see so much violence towards women therein. And we'll talk about today in the webinar some of the content in pornography and how that's impacting attitudes and behaviors. But first, I really want to chat about how the industry has evolved. So, in decades past, we have likely seen pornography in spaces like magazines, Playboy, Hustler, Penthouse. We've seen video rentals for pornography. Think 80s and 90s in your minds right now. There are adult theaters that used to cater to pornography. But now, that pornography has saturated the market. It's all over the internet. And in fact, it's really pornified our culture, wherein our culture is laden with pornographic messages, and that the pornography therein is not necessarily relegated to the porn industry. So we see magazine covers, television commercials, music videos, Halloween costumes, children and teen clothing options, all are awash with hypersexualized imagery, not unlike the imagery that we once saw in the early pornography industry. And I should note here, when I tease out factors like advertising, where women are objectified and highly sexualized, I'm not shaming any of the individual women therein. Women who appear in these advertisements and music videos, in movies, on an individual level, it can be really empowering, right? Owning and expressing one's sexuality is exciting. But I worry that on a cultural level, these pornified messages, these objectifying messages, are ultimately disempowering. When women are constructed as hypersexual playthings existing for men's pleasure and not their own. So indeed, what I feel like is that even though on an individual level something may be empowering, the images that we see for those people depicted may be sexually gratifying, it's not necessarily empowering for all. So if we are entrenched in a culture where we see pornographic imagery and messaging all the time, where does that leave the actual pornography industry? How does it compete, so to speak, with our pornified popular culture? Well, let's talk a little bit about, though, what pornography is and what pornography isn't when we're talking about the industry and what I'm coming from my perspective. I'm not talking about erotica when I talk about mainstream internet pornography or when I research it. And erotica, if you're unfamiliar, erotica essentially displays overtly consensual relations. There's affection, there's no objectification, no elements of dehumanization. While there has been research on erotica, what I'm talking about is internet pornography. And I think that when we talk about pornography, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we could even dichotomize that into softcore pornography and hardcore pornography. And indeed, the word hardcore is rarely used today to describe porn because most of the internet porn would arguably be characterized as hardcore. So when I'm having this conversation with you all today, when I say mainstream pornography, I'm talking about the hardcore content that's freely available on the internet en masse. It's all marketed to, or a bunch of it is marketed to heterosexual men. It's created for them, marketed to them, and a lot of it, as we'll see moving forward, contains violence, and particularly violence targeted at women. I've also seen internet pornography sort of escalate in terms of the content that it depicts and the violence therein. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I also want to note here today, I'm not talking specifically about child pornography or non-consensual pornography. That's outside the scope of this webinar. Again, I'm talking about freely available internet pornography that we can find on a whole mess of sites online. So let's get into what that stuff looks like and where it's available. So some of the most popular pornographic websites in the United States include Pornhub.com, and I'll be picking on them a lot today because they're sort of one of the most mainstream and culturally integrated pornographic websites to date. And they also do a lot of work around analyzing the data of users on their site. So I'll talk a little bit about content on their site specifically today. There's also youporn.com. I highlighted xvideos.com actually because my dissertation is looking at data from xvideos.com. All of these sites, they're freely accessible, endlessly searchable. There's little to no fees in order to engage with the content. A lot of the content on these sites is user-generated. So that's actually why I'm looking at xvideos.com is they have a feature on their website for anyone to download all of their data from their site and to analyze it if they would choose to do so. So what's interesting about xvideos and other sites like them is they have features that allow users to interact on the website, almost like a social media component. So people can create and curate their own profiles on the website. They can like videos on the website, tag them, engage with the video by leaving comments, much like YouTube. So it's quite a fascinating sort of microcosm of our social media culture within some of these porn websites. And when I say user-generated content on these websites, I mean that users can upload videos, share videos, and connect with others and market their own content if they so choose. But that's a listing of some of the most popular ones in the U.S. Like I said, I'm going to be picking on Pornhub.com today for a specific reason. They do a very good job at annually and biannually sort of analyzing the data on their website so they can give us some really good insight into how many people are visiting and the type of content that they're looking at. So this data is available at Pornhub Insights. So if you just Google Pornhub Insights, it'll take you right to their page in which they analyze all their data, and they actually do a really great job at this. They sort of highlight different topics that someone may be searching on the website, what countries find particular searches the most popular. It's quite an interesting layout of data that they've sort of worked with there. But in terms of their data, for 1 year in 2016, we can see how popular internet pornography is by just taking a gander at one of the most popular internet websites. So according to their data, they had 92 billion videos that were watched in 2016 alone. They had 64 million visitors per day on their website. And they sort of brag about the fact within their data, they talk about that that's a total of 4.6 billion hours of pornography consumed in 1 year alone. That tells me what we've probably already known, that pornography is incredibly popular. And although this is data from one website, we can certainly extrapolate that interest to others online. I should mention also that Pornhub, like I said, has done a good job at integrating themselves into even mainstream culture by having billboards in New York City, by marketing themselves in a way that sort of makes them a bit more palatable for most audiences. They're sort of seen as the everyman's porn website, right? And many people know them by name. So I will be picking on them throughout the day, only if because they have a really great mechanism to analyze some of the content on their website. So suffice it to say, pornography is easily accessible online by anyone. You can do so anonymously. And by and large, people are not paying for pornography anymore. They're not buying DVDs. They're not even necessarily downloading content. They're likely streaming internet pornography online for free. And this has tremendous implications given how much content is available and how many people are accessing it. And I think all of that, coupled with the fact that we rarely have formal conversations about pornography, especially with young people, this can have a huge impact, and a detrimental one, as we'll see moving forward. So that's some insight into where I'm coming from in terms of internet pornography and what's the most popular and who's consuming it and by how much. But let's talk a little bit about how Pornhub has navigated themselves and mainstreamed themselves to the point where they have a different subset of their website that even talks about sexual wellness. I share this with you. It's a bit off topic, but I share this with you because I found it absolutely fascinating. So one of the largest pornographic websites in the United States now has a subsection of their website dedicated to providing users with information about sexual wellness. In my opinion, I think this is a great example of commodified altruism, where they are seemingly benevolent in their marketing of their sexual wellness center on the website, and sure, a lot of people can get some pretty good information from this website, especially if they don't have access to comprehensive sex education. But I'm skeptical of the impact of something like this, or the idea that a pornographic website would be the one delineating information on sexual decision-making and reproductive health. I think that a lot of people may find it useful given the abysmal status of comprehensive sex ed in the U.S., but I feel like unless Pornhub sort of confronts the rampant misogyny and violence on their website, especially towards women, I can't hop on board with it. For example, when I first found out that this website was available, or the subset of the website was available, I decided I'd go to Pornhub.com, look at the main page of the site. Generally, that's where all the most popular videos are located. And I decided to say, hey, if they're so interested in looking at sexual wellness, let's see if they've, omitted all of the sexually violent content off their site. So that day I went on the main page, and one of the first videos and screen grabs that I saw was a video that depicted an extremely painful and rough sexual act perpetrated upon a woman by multiple men. In fact, the title of the video was, quote, "Extreme Painful First Anal and Brutal Crying Gangbang and Rough," end quote. Admittedly, that's a rather vapid user-generated title, but either way, if Pornhub is going to market their new sexual education website, but in the same breath host videos where women are highlighted as being in pain and crying during rough sex, I have to call BS on that. And I thought it would be pretty important for you all to know that now pornographic websites are in the business of delineating content on sexual health to their users. And that could maybe inform some of your perspectives on this topic. So again, freely available, pornhub.com/sex. You can sort of look at their content and see what they're giving to their consumers. So moving on, let's talk about the actual content on mainstream websites. I chatted a little bit about how I'm seeing rampant violence throughout this content, but let's see what the research and data tells us. There was a recent content analysis examining sexual agency, objectification, and aggression within internet pornography. And this is consistent, the study that I'm referencing right now, with a lot of previous research that indicates that the bulk of mainstream freely available internet pornography contains abuse towards women in a variety of forms. So this study in 2017 actually found that mainstream pornography had a significant amount of violence towards women. So they found that women are, quote, "the normalized target of physical aggression perpetrated by men," and that, quote, "it occurred at an alarming rate within the sample that they looked at." They also found that the content systematically objectifies women or otherwise constructs women as objects existing for male desire. Again, I show you one study, but this is consistent with a bulk of previous research on this topic. And the previous research has also shown that there's some themes that we can tease out in mainstream internet pornography marketed to men. One of those themes is that, one, all women want sex from all men. Women are portrayed as nymphomaniacs whose desire and complicity is seemingly endless, and they portray men as sexual subjects and women as masturbatory tools. Another theme that we see in mainstream internet pornography is that women enjoy all sex acts that men desire and perform, even those that are blatantly degrading, aggressive, and violent. And the last theme that researchers have teased out is that women who resist any of these degrading, aggressive, or violent acts, they're depicted as being easily persuaded into engaging in these behaviors. So aggression, according to these tropes, is what women want. And thus, the viewer can refrain from questioning why he or she may like this content or enjoy this content wherein women are being treated inhumanely, because women are portrayed as wanting and desiring this sort of behavior. This becomes important later on when we talk about the impact on both adolescents and adults when they're watching this content. It's certainly having a quantifiable impact on behavior and specifically sexual aggression. So let's continue with that, what other themes that we may see, other actions we may see here in pornography. Overall, we see that sex is violent and that violence is sexy. We see abusive behaviors, like I said, physical and verbal abuse happening within this content. We see degrading imagery. And in fact, I should back up a little bit. I almost never mention when I'm having or giving a presentation on pornography things like the, quote, money shot, where women are kneeling in submission to a male orgasm. I rarely mention that because it's such a fixture now, and other more abusive, degrading, and violent acts are so prevalent that it sort of gets drowned out in all of the rest of the violence. In terms of painful sex that we see depicted in these videos, we're seeing things like extreme anal sex. And I should note here that anal sex wasn't even a fixture in porn until the late 90s and early 2000s. It was considered sort of a niche genre, but now it's been so normalized and viewers are so desensitized to it that we're seeing it all the time in more extreme ways. We're seeing things like women being penetrated in multiple ways. We're seeing women being gagged by men on film. We're seeing women as overwhelmingly the target of this type of violence in pornography. It's highly gendered. And I think something important to point out here when we talk about elements of painful sex and abusive behaviors, a lot of this content, when the violence is being perpetrated on the female target, it may be paired with close-ups on women's grimacing faces, on their tears, and running makeup. In fact, producers will put heavy mascara, depending on the film or what they're trying to depict, but they might put heavy mascara on one of the female performers. So when she cries during the film, you see that makeup running down her face, and they'll likely market that content with a screen grab of a woman's grimacing face with makeup running down. So this is all common. I'm not pulling from niche genres here when I talk about these abusive behaviors and painful sex. This is a fixture of the mainstream pornography industry. You could go to any one of the sites I mentioned, and I would hazard to guess on the first couple of main pages, you would find screen grabs and videos depicting this content. I think one of the criticisms that myself and other scholars who research this often get is that we're somehow pulling from extraneous, niche, highly violent content, and that's simply not true. This is a mainstream fixture of the pornography industry, and you could go to any site right now and see this occurring. So this is very, very common. Another thing I'll note really briefly is that while pornography is highly gendered, it also intersects with things like race and class. So we see a lot of racist tropes happening within pornography and being portrayed and being marketed as such. We also see classist tropes. For example, there's videos depicting economic exploitation, depicting women needing money for a ride. There's even a new genre with women selling things at pawn shops and being coerced or pressured into engaging in sexual activity with the pawn shop owner for more money or what have you. But all of these things are occurring on an intersection. We just want to note that really quickly, that this violence is running the gamut across different intersections of individuals depicted therein. So in the interest of time, we want to move forward. Let's talk about some specific genres where we're seeing all this stuff happening. So a couple of popular, really, really popular genres are teen pornography and incest pornography. Mind you, this is all legal and often one of the #1 search term on many sites. No crime is actually taking place with teen pornography and incest pornography. It's all performers likely consenting to engaging in this behavior. But this is really predicated on sexual violence that people find unproblematic. It's evidenced by the popularity of these terms. So like I said, teen pornography in particular, often one of the most searched out categories of pornography. In fact, Pornhub denotes it as the 4th most popular search term. Oftentimes, it will celebrate and normalize sexual desire for young people under the guise that the people that are depicted or performers that are depicted therein are actually of legal age. Performers in teen pornography may be styled to look much younger than their chronological age. They may have pigtails. They may depict performers behaving innocently, altering their voices and language to sound much younger than they are. Women are often referred to as, quote, teenies, as little, skinny, petite. You know, they're dressed to look like children. There might even be childlike props within the setting where this the teen porn genre is being filmed. So there might be teddy bears. The room might be set up to look very childlike, right down to childlike wallpaper. I've certainly seen that in some of these mainstream films. So scholars have referred to much of the teen porn genre that depicts this sort of age dichotomy, and especially the ones that depict women performers looking much younger than their chronological age as pseudo-child pornography, because there's such a palpable interest in performers who look much younger than their chronological age. And again, this is quite popular content. It may even depict within the teen porn genre and within the incest porn genre a great age differentiation between performers. So there might be much older men engaged in sex acts with much younger women. These men might be depicted as coaches, as teachers, neighbors. In terms of incest pornography in particular, they might be dad or stepdad or something like that. There's certainly depictions of inequitable and inherently coercive power dynamics that can take place within this setting. In terms of incest pornography in particular, this is becoming quite disturbing given its rise in popularity. In fact, Pornhub, in their yearly review of the content and interest on their site, highlight that 3 of the top 10 search terms involve intrafamilial themes. So popular searches include stepmom and son, daddy, and perhaps most disturbingly, daddy's little princess. What's particularly interesting about this Pornhub data is they note in 2015 on Mother's Day and on Father's Day, they had significant upticks in searches for videos depicting mothers and fathers. Quite interesting, albeit horrifying, statistics coming out of that website. So the popularity of these searches, of these genres, indicate to me that for viewers, this is considered to be unproblematic, that nobody's really scrutinizing the fact that we're depicting performers as much younger than their chronological age. We're not considering the fact that there are actually victims of intrafamilial sexual violence whose stories are being co-opted by the porn industry and being used to market this highly, highly popular content. Of course, there's many genres that I could talk about in terms of mainstream porn, but I picked these 2 genres out for you all because I know you're entrenched in the work in sexual violence, and I know that you're highly familiar with intrafamilial sexual violence as well as those perpetrating child sexual abuse, and this is being depicted, in pornography, legal pornography, very popular pornography on mainstream websites. So if I haven't disturbed you enough, which I'm sure I have, there is a demand for more and more extreme content. Viewers are becoming desensitized to much of the violence, so we're seeing an uptick in genres like torture pornography and rape pornography. So torture pornography in particular would depict physical acts of torture. It may be within the BDSM genre, but I don't want to confuse the acts depicted therein with the BDSM community, whose practices generally methodically highlight mutuality and consent. There's generally a dialogue within those traditional BDSM communities. But on the mainstream hub websites, there's like snippets of videos, right? So viewers are simply seeing these acts of torture without having the background necessarily of consent, mutuality, and conversations around sexual decision making within these contexts. So there's a lot of interest in torture pornography. And then also I've done some research on rape-oriented pornography or pornography depicting sexual assault. Sometimes on the mainstream Pornhub or porn websites, it won't necessarily be categorized or searchable as, quote, rape pornography, but rather they'll sanitize the language a little bit. So you might see searches for, quote, forced sex or sleeping or depicting young performers as drunk or unconscious or otherwise hypnotized. So it's all depicting the same thing, right, like sexual assault, but they may not label it as such. Makes it a bit easier for the viewer to wrap their head around the fact that they're watching this content if they don't place the word rape right in front of it. Of course, we know there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that goes on with the language that we use around sexual violence, and this is no different than that. So this stuff is growing in popularity. In fact, I can show you, my co-author made this really great chart for you all to sort of highlight the popularity of rape-oriented pornography in particular. We wrote a paper looking at Google search trends data, which examines Google searches for specific search terms over periods of time. And we wanted to highlight how popular interest in rape-oriented pornography is. So here I'll show you, it's quite jarring when you see it. So you'll see things like force porn being a highly searchable term on Google, torture porn, rape scene, rape porn videos, and free rape porn, all escalating over time. I don't know if anybody's familiar. It's kind of hard to see here on the webinar on the screen, but you see those peaks happening around 2006, 2007. We've associated that with the advent of the mainstream pornographic hub websites where people were being now exposed en masse to content depicting sexual violence, so they were then seeking it out with a bit more brevity after that implementation. So you can see here, this is not just feminist conjecture or unsubstantiated worry about this sort of content. Like, it is indeed growing in popularity. More people are being exposed to it, and it's having some pretty damaging impacts. So in the interest of time, let's move forward. Let's talk about the impacts on behavior, on young people, on all of that stuff, because I think that's incredibly important when we're having this conversation. So take a deep breath. We'll move on, even though that's very disturbing to look at. Let's look at the attitudes and behavioral impacts from pornography. Let's talk about what the research tells us, because I can talk till I'm blue in the face about how much violence is taking place in mainstream internet pornography, but I think until I deliver some data on what scholars are looking at and seeing as the impact of consumption, I think it might fall on deaf ears. Not for you all, but I think for those who may not be versed in the topics that we generally talk about. So let's talk about this. Okay, so sex miseducation and pornography. I think that pornography is such a huge industry that it's so easy. It's freely accessed. There's unrestricted access that young people are viewing this content without maybe even realizing. So they have easy access to pornography, to porn websites on smartphones, tablets, computers. There may be a natural curiosity to seek out such content, or they may be seeing this content from friends, from peers, that sort of thing. A lot of the research tells us that exposure is very common at a young age to pornography. So boys are generally exposed around ages 11 to 12, whereas girls a little later, 13 to 14. Again, they may be unwittingly accessing abusive content like the content that I just talked about, all while trying to experiment with their sexuality. They're curious, but this is all happening without comprehensive sex ed. So there's no sort of background in navigating one's sexuality age appropriately. There's simply a lot of pornography available to young people. A couple of issues here that I have seen is that parents are generally under-equipped to discuss pornography use. And that's unsurprising. I mean, unless you're entrenched in this data, you may not know how easily accessible this stuff is, how violent the content is, and that your young person in your life may be unwittingly or wittingly accessing this content. And again, if this is sort of falling on a continuum of sex education in our country or lack thereof, wherein even some of the best comprehensive sex education programs may not be touching on pornography and the impact on attitudes and behaviors of young people, we're not having enough conversations with our young people or even with our adults in our country about the impact of this content. Anecdotally, from practitioners I've worked with, from those I've given presentations to, I've heard stories about children as young as second graders accessing pornography on their own or via friends, and they may be scared. They may have questions about the content, but they're scared of telling adults. They don't really know how to talk about it, right? They don't have the verbiage to talk about that, and they may be fearful both younger and older children and adolescents about having their technology taken away if they do ask mom or dad or an adult in their life about the content, right? They're very fearful, they're confused, and I think that it's becoming more and more detrimental, especially given how easily accessible this content is for everyone, let alone adolescents. So when we talk about the idea that children, adolescents, teens are accessing this content, let's talk about the impact of that. There's been a lot of research around pornography consumption and the impact on adolescents. So I'll highlight a couple here for you. In a systematic review of the literature from 1995 to 2015, scholars Peter and Valkerenberg, 2016, they note that there's some pretty specific trends we're seeing in terms of the impact of pornography on adolescents. And by and large, pornography is impacting attitudes and behaviors of young people. So the studies that they looked at, it was largely survey data. It was about 40-plus studies, and they found some pretty consistent themes. Number one, consumption of pornography is highly gendered. Boys generally use out of curiosity. They're using for sexual arousal, for entertainment. They're also using with peers and their friends and having conversations about it therein. Girls, on the other hand, a lot of the research is telling us girls are repelled by pornography. They find it dumb and gross. They aren't using it for the same reasons or having access to it for the same reasons as young boys. Consumption is also associated with, in terms of their study in particular, they found it's more permissive sexual attitudes and more experience with casual sex. They found that young people were more likely to adhere to gender stereotypical beliefs, like that men are dominant, women are submissive, men are supposed to be the sexual gate crashers and women sexual gatekeepers. And perhaps most importantly, they found that a higher likelihood to engage in sexual aggression when one would engage with pornography or consume pornography, and that was consistent for the boys in this sample. And then they found that pornography consumption was linked to a higher likelihood of sexual victimization for young girls. So this is having an impact, right? This is a tangible piece of evidence that shows us that young people are being impacted by pornography, and this is not the only evidence. Some longitudinal data has shown that over a period of 6 years, these scholars, Thompson and Ybarra and Thompson, have found that in their study looking at all of these, looking at survey data, the tracking 10 to 15-year-olds over a 5-year period, they've shown that current exposure to violent pornography was, quote, strongly associated with the emergence of sexual violence perpetration. So this is yet another example of empirical data highlighting the detrimental impact of pornography on young people, wherein it is inextricably linked to sexual aggression in young people. And this not only goes for, or this isn't always, so palpable, I think, in quantitative studies. We can really tease out some good data from qualitative research as well. So there was a couple of studies in 2015 that I found extremely fascinating, looking at anal sex and heterosexual partnerships in terms of sexual experimentation. So presumably a consequence of porn's representations of anal sex and just the likelihood that one consuming pornography would see such acts performed, we're seeing a lot of young people experimenting with anal sex more frequently. So these two studies in particular were interviewing young people about this, and they teased out a couple of themes around heterosexual couples engaging in sexual experimentation in terms of anal sex. So the first theme was there was a normalization for young people of coercive tactics. So women were reluctantly acquiescing to pressure to engage in this behavior. So one young woman was quoted as saying, "He begged and begged, and he said I was stupid for not wanting to do it." And then a young man was quoted as saying, "I can be very persuasive. Like sometimes you just keep going till they get fed up and they let you do it anyway." So we're seeing this pressure, this coercion, this normalization of abusive tactics and violence within young people experimenting. And the author extrapolated this is likely due to pornography depicting these acts. The second theme we're seeing here is the normalization of pain and discomfort for women in particular. So it was framed in both of these studies that it was something to be enjoyed by men and endured by women. So a young woman surveyed here said, I just wasn't into it. He didn't seem to care. I wasn't getting aroused by it at all. It was just painful. So of note in these two studies is, number one, that this is happening with more frequency, that young people are experimenting with anal sex. And that within all the narratives that we're seeing in this research, that mutuality, consent, and women's pleasure is largely absent from young people's narratives around this topic. Again, particularly disturbing, and it shows us how impactful pornography is for young people. Another study looking at 16, 17, and 18-year-olds who are watching porn and sort of copying what they saw in their own sexual encounters. This is particularly fascinating, albeit horrifying. I pull out this quote because it's so impactful. This was a 17-year-old man. He was inspired by pornography. He described a time when he used his smartphone to videotape himself having sex with his girlfriend without her consent. So here's the quote, we was together as partners. She couldn't really tell me no. I mean, she could have, because, but I don't think she would have told me no. Just because, I was her boyfriend, and if I wanted to take a video, So this here we see like this omnipotent cultural myth that sex and consent are givens within the context of a pre-existing relationship. We see young people taking it for granted that just because they're in a partnership that means consent is something that shouldn't have to be navigated, and it's disturbing. And we also see within this particular example an example of non-consensual pornography, or something that many of us have heard referred to in the past as revenge porn. We see videos, pictures being taken without a victim's consent. They may even be uploaded to the internet, may be used to terrorize a victim, or sort of traumatize someone, humiliate a victim. But this is a good example of that, wherein this young person, was engaging in this behavior and thought that it was totally normal and unproblematic. Same study, here we have an 18-year-old woman who describes experimenting with her partner. He was trying to pressure her into engaging in some of the sexual acts that he witnessed in pornography. So she says, the position is with me laying down on my stomach, and he was just sort of laying down on top of me. I don't know, it was kind of extreme. It feels like rape. I just can't move. It feels like there's something that, it just doesn't feel like it's not that comfortable. Yeah, it doesn't feel like what couples should do. So again, we see here where this normalization of pain, discomfort, pressure, coercion, all within these narratives, within young people who are experimenting with their sexuality and who are being influenced by pornography that teaches us that violence and sex are two things that go together within most sexual situations. So it's quite disturbing. So this is not only impacting teens and adolescents, right? This is impacting adults as well. I think that, when I speak to adults in the community, we'd like to think that advertising, that media doesn't impact us, that we're somehow above reproach when it comes to media influencing our behavior. But research has shown that media impacts adults much like it impacts adolescents. And in this particular case, pornography is having palpable impacts on adults who are also navigating sexuality. So this study was from Wright, Gonda, and Cross in 2015. This was largely examining adults sampled, as I said. This is a meta-analysis of 22 studies across 7 countries. And they were looking at, does pornography consumption, is that in any way associated with committing acts of sexual aggression? And this study found, quote, consumption of pornography was associated with sexual aggression both in the United States and internationally. These results were consistent both across men and women. And these associations were stronger for verbal aggression rather than physical, but they were both significant. And the authors were quoted as saying, the general pattern of results suggested that violent content may be an exacerbating factor in terms of sexual violence. So again, this reiterates pornography is not just a harmless fantasy. It has palpable impacts on both attitudes and behaviors of young people and adults alike. And if we're not having conversations around this, these results will continue to emerge. So research also tells us that pornography is associated with those surveyed having adherence to beliefs in rape myths, to adherence to victim-blaming sentiments. Research on pornography consumption has also shown that those who consume more pornography are less likely to intervene if they were a bystander witnessing sexual violence. This is actually, the bystander intervention piece is actually consistent for both men and women sampled. Those who watched more pornography were less likely to engage as a bystander. And then this last component here is particularly interesting. This is a DOJ study that looked at human trafficking. They weren't specifically looking at pornography, but one of the findings inherent to this research was that those who consume pornography were more likely to know what human trafficking was, and particularly sex trafficking, but they believed that these were less serious offenses and didn't warrant governmental intervention. Particularly interesting, right? That we're seeing a bunch of research here telling us that pornography is specifically linked to different attitudes and behaviors surrounding sexual violence, and not in a positive way. We're seeing people who are less inclined to help as bystanders, more likely to engage in victim-blaming rhetoric, more likely to believe rape myths, and less likely to think that sexual violence is problematic within our culture and for victims. So this is pretty jarring. It also has linkages. Pornography has linkages to actual contact offenses. As many of you are working in the community, specifically advocates working with victims, you all know this, right? Pornography is used by perpetrators of childhood sexual abuse, by perpetrators of intimate partner violence, of sexual violence, and of sex trafficking. Victims may be pressured to view, imitate, participate in pornography. It's used to groom victims, to test boundaries, to normalize sex, especially with young people. We see research that tells us domestic violence victims being forced to watch pornography and engage in sexual acts depicted therein. We hear about sex trafficking victims who are often trained to perform for those who are engaging with them via pornography. Moreover, webcamming is becoming a huge market for those who are wishing to sex traffic, right? And we're seeing a lot of victims of sex trafficking being forced to engage in behaviors that they would see in pornography, being trained via pornography. It's quite disturbing. I was also talking with some practitioners in the field around some of the victims of sexual violence that they've seen, of domestic violence, and they've noted to me that a lot of the victims who come forward note that there were linkages within the sexual violence that they reported to the pornography that their partner or their perpetrator was watching, or that they were being forced to engage in some of these behaviors, and it's quite disturbing. So we may miss this, so that some of us working in the field, that pornography can play a role either directly or indirectly, and whether a victim can create that linkage or not. Like, this stuff is happening, it's impacting behavior, and it's happening within pre-existing situations that involve violence. So it's quite disturbing here. So, all right. I know I'm going to take a bit of a turn here. So we've learned today about what the content is online in terms of pornography. We've learned how it's impacting adolescents and adults. I've gone over how it's linked to contact offenses and to sexual aggression, both verbal, physical, and even attitudinal shifts. So let's talk about now how you can take all of the information that I chatted about today, and admittedly there's a lot, and sort of delineate that to the groups of people that you may work with. because you have to sort of be prepared within our work to have these conversations given how prevalent pornography is. So I don't know about you, I get kind of bummed out when webinars don't know or don't address how to apply the information. So I really want to give you this info of how to apply this. So a couple of things with beginning and sustaining this conversation with those that you're working with. First one, create a safe space to have the conversation. Create a space where people feel comfortable sharing, and I'm sure many of you are adept at doing that just vicarious of the work that we already do. In my experience, when you have this conversation with a group of people or an individual, this is likely the first time that many, many people have ever been given the space to formally discuss pornography. You really should try to meet those participants where they're at and try to gauge the room in terms of their proficiency. Sometimes you will be surprised by how little they know about the industry, and sometimes you will be surprised how little you know about this content, and especially young people's proficiency with it. So when you're creating that safe space, make sure that your comfort level is going to be translated to how comfortable the audience members feel with sharing, conversing, and dialoguing. So try to be as comfortable as possible with delineating this information. Moreover, just note that some of the people that you're working with, they may, especially students, young people, they might say something unwittingly offensive. And if that happens, I kind of view it as I'm doing something right. Like if someone is candid enough to share with me an anecdote that I might personally find offensive. And I'll give you an example of that. I was giving a presentation to some fraternity men around pornography consumption and just leaving an open, candid dialogue. One of the men mentioned, when I was asking if there was any follow-up information they wanted me to share or any questions or commentary, one mentioned that he had a problem with pornography because he found it problematic within his relationship. He found that he was getting angrier and resentful towards his girlfriend because she didn't want to engage in some of the behaviors that he saw in pornography, nor did she look like the people that he saw in pornography. And I'm being gentle with my language here, how he delineated that information to me, but note that the inner feminist inside myself was cringing when I was hearing this, but outwardly, I was quite happy that I was able to create an environment where he felt comfortable enough sharing that, and feeling like the space was open enough for him to share that openly. But it was kind of a candid anecdote from one of these presentations where, I found that people will share when given the opportunity, and you just have to be prepared for that. The second one here, use disclaimers. Prepare your audience for what they're going to see and they're going to hear. Let them know it's going to be graphic. Let them know you're not there to shame or pathologize them. That may take some people off the defensive, especially young men, when you sort of tell them that that's the perspective that you're coming from. Try to be sex positive as much as possible, and let them know where your focus is lying. Like if you're talking about, like I have today, mainstream pornographic content, let them know that. And then also, I always give this disclaimer when talking with students because I find it critical, especially when working with young men. I say something like, I can be critical of pornography without being anti-sex, just like I can be critical of McDonald's business practices without being anti-food. So I sort of set the stage, let them know I'm not shaming, pathologizing, I'm trying to come from a sex-positive lens, but we have to look at this critically. Third one here, workshop your workshop. Adaptation is better than programmatic fidelity in some cases. I make sure to tailor it to my audience. My conversations with incoming fraternity men are going to obviously be different than conversations I might have with you all or staff here at the university or something like that. I do make sure, though, in terms of fidelity of my programming, that I always couch the conversation within a conversation about rape culture, because I think it's important to set that stage and that framework for those listening, to let them know that pornography is not occurring in isolation, and while there are a constellation of factors that sort of lubricate the path for sexual violence to occur within our culture, pornography is a big influence on that. I also try to add relevant content and try to be culturally competent depending on which program or which audience I'm working with, just to make sure that I'm adapting it as best I can. Be open, honest, and authentic, and accept embarrassment, and use humor. I try to use humor as much as possible. It kind of lightens the mood. It curbs the idea that I'm shaming anyone or that I'm being preachy in any way. I'm sort of coming from a non-judgmental space, so that's pretty helpful. You know, you might hear things that make you uncomfortable, like I said, and some participants may even test your comfort level, but just try to be open and authentic and honest to who you are and the perspective that you're coming from with this topic. Again, try to eliminate shame, be as sex positive as possible. You're not trying to stifle anybody's sexuality or eliminate porn altogether. That's not realistic, but rather you're requesting that a group of people who are sitting in front of you critically examine the content and how it impacts their own lives and the lives of other people. Of course, everything I'm saying right now, these are all best practices, right, in my experience. But let's say now that you're in a rural area of Wisconsin, or otherwise you're the only person from your office who can provide a training like this. You got to adapt that content accordingly for your comfort level, for your knowledge level, and for your audience. Just keep that in mind. And another thing here, you know, are you going to completely alter someone's viewing habits based off the information? You know, maybe, you know, in an ideal world, in our utopian viewpoint, that might happen, but, you know, it's unlikely. But at best, when I'm having these conversations, what I hope to achieve is to create a space where a dialogue can be had, a much-needed dialogue can be had about these issues. Because in my experience, so many people have had no conversations, formal or otherwise, about pornography prior to listening to me, and in your case, prior to listening to you. So you're providing a much-needed service around this topic to those that you're speaking with. And I know all of you listening are wholly competent to do this, and you will be absolutely fine if you ever do find yourself having this conversation. But, you know, I share all of this with you to make sure that this conversation is being sustained and continued within the groups of people that we work with, given the impact that I talked about today. So we're winding down here. In conclusion, research consistently indicates that pornography is violent and objectifying towards women, and that it impacts our work. And it is imperative for those of us in the field to begin and sustain conversations about this impact, even if those conversations are difficult and admittingly very uncomfortable. Again, I'm confident you all are well prepared to have these conversations because you have conversations around sexual violence and gender violence more broadly every single day. So I'm confident you all will be absolutely fine. A couple of things I want to touch on here in case you want more information. There's some films that you can take a look at. Don John is the first one I list here. This is a mainstream feature film. It has Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it, Scarlett Johansson, Julianne Moore. If you haven't seen it, it's a really great film talking about how young men can become addicted to pornography and how it impacts their relationships with the women in their life and their relationship with their own masculinity. I've actually screened this film with a group of fraternity men, and then we had some constructive conversations around pornography afterward. I would also direct you to a fantastic documentary on Netflix, Hot Girls Wanted. It depicts all of sort of the seedy elements of the porn industry, shows you actual performers navigating that industry, and highlights how the industry can really suck in and spit out, so to speak, all of these young women who are looking to engage in the industry, looking to perform, how detrimental it can be for their lives. It's really problematic, but this documentary does a great job at that. And they actually just released a 6-7-part, maybe, mini documentary series under the same title, in which they talk about these issues in varying forms. I would highly recommend that. Also, I'm sure you all are very familiar with the Media Education Foundation. The Mask I Live In is a phenomenal film, and I think all young men should see it, as I'm sure you would agree. It doesn't specifically touch on pornography throughout, but it does talk about men's violence, masculinity, and how impactful that can be for our culture and the young men within. A bit of an older couple of films here, but The Price of Pleasure and Bro Code also talk about masculinity and do touch on pornography more particularly, so you could definitely look at those. In terms of books, Peggy Ornstein's book, Girls and Sex, was fantastic. She sort of interviews a lot of young women about navigating this new pornified sexual landscape and how that's been impacting them. It was a really easy read, fascinating read, and I encourage you all to pick that one up. Kate Harding, same thing, great book on rape culture and how that's permeated our culture. I give that to all of my students in my Violence Towards Women classes. Pretty easy read for those who are looking for more information on that. And then lastly, just because I love Jessica Valenti, her book, Sex Objects, it's her memoir. She does a great job at sort of highlighting how our sexualized culture has impacted her in particularly, and it's just a fantastic read, so I would encourage that as well. All right, so we've come to the end here. You'll see my email address is listed just in case you don't have time to answer questions or you want to follow up with me at a later date. But I think now is the time when we can take some questions from audience members, and I think maybe Peter and Megan are going to hop in here and help me with this.
So we do have a couple questions from the chat box here.
Alrighty.
And one of our advocates from a local program, or actually prevention educator from one of our local programs, asked, I'm curious where/how you would locate, and this popped up during the slide about erotica and pornography, where you would locate the BDSM genre in all of this. If it does overtly address consent but inherently involves power dynamics, it might look violent. What are the implications for the discourse around sexual violence? I know this is kind of a tangential question, so no worries if there's not time to address.
I think when we talk about, or when I say something like the BDSM community in practice is generally very focused on mutuality and consent, I'm not necessarily talking about videos that may depict BDSM, but rather those conversations on the ground happening, with real people. When I have a conversation around BDSM, I make sure that I delineate between the community and between some of the imagery that's depicted on these mainstream pornographic websites, because most of the imagery is just snapshots of these instances of violence, and to the uninformed, or to young people especially, they're simply witnessing violence and not necessarily having the background of what the traditional community would view as consensual mutual behavior. So I don't know if that answered the question. I can certainly address that via email if the individual asking wanted to break that down a bit more. But yeah, for the perspective I'm coming from when talking about BDSM porn and specifically looking at the videos that highlight like torture and physical acts of violence, I'm looking at the snapshots that we're seeing and not necessarily the community at large. So I hope that answered it.
That makes so much sense when I didn't even think about it that way until you brought up the BDSM community versus BDSM videos online kind of thing. Why would we expect that to be a more accurate depiction when pornography isn't an accurate depiction of, in a lot of cases, of many sex acts? Why would it be an accurate depiction of the BDSM community?
Oh, right, absolutely. And it's so performative that, again, it's being sort of co-opted by these, snippets of videos wherein, someone without that background or who's not entrenched in that community, all they're seeing is the violence. They're not necessarily understanding the background to it or how that may play out in their own sexuality. Like, I'm really thinking about the fact that young people are particularly looking at this content without having that background, so it's problematic.
Yeah, great. So on to the next question. How do you sustain yourself with this work and this research? It seems like it could be could see this as traumatizing work to view problematic pornography.
Yes. So you saw my cat at the beginning. He's very helpful. He's my emotional support animal and self-care. At this point, more seriously, I do try to think of it more clinically. I do try to separate myself from viewing the content. A lot of the things that I'm actually researching, I don't necessarily, especially for my dissertation, have to view the actual content, but rather look at sort of the metadata from that content. In many ways, my data that I look at, what I find maybe particularly disturbing, even maybe more so than the actual content that I see, is some of the comments that are on the videos, especially the highly violent videos. I have seen things like comments on videos for rape-oriented pornography in particular, like comments like, I wish I could do this to actually the pizza delivery girl. So I saw a comment once on a rape-oriented porn video where the individual denoted that he wished he could do the exact same thing depicted in the rape porn video to the local pizza delivery girl in his neighborhood. So all of that stuff in the entire constellation of things that I'm looking at, they can be very trying and traumatic. I try to look at it clinically as best I can, and much like many of you, I try to engage in as much self-care as humanly flippin' possible, given the content and given how prevalent this stuff is. I think it would overwhelm me and drown me in all of the negative emotions if I didn't engage in as much self-care, especially cat-related self-care, as humanly possible.
Yeah, so that actually leads really well into the next question that we had, which is how do you respond when someone says that porn actually prevents sexual assault by allowing someone to watch it instead of acting on violent fantasies?
That's a good question. There's been some research around that, but I would then show them the bulk of research that I have that indicates that pornography consumption is directly related to behavioral changes, and particularly behavioral changes around sexual aggression. I've certainly had those comments before, sort of contradicting some of the data, but while it may be an outlet for some, I think by and large it's becoming more problematic because it's taking a bunch of people and normalizing sexual aggression. And yeah, I would definitely show them all of the huge binders of pornographic research that I have, which sound more titillating than it actually is. It's just binders of journal articles depicting how detrimental pornography consumption can be for attitudes and behaviors. So I would bore them to tears, essentially, with the data.
So someone else asked about how you have made the case for having this conversation with young people in terms of the institutional buy-in.
I've actually never quite had a problem with that. That likely is due to the fact that I'm squarely located in the Pacific Northwest. Washington State has really great sex education, so when they hit the college campuses, most people are pretty open to having conversations not only around sexual violence, but around pornography. I also have some good contacts within the Greek system here, and I think that there is more of an awareness, especially within university settings and student affairs, that this can be impactful for young people and that it's important that we address it. I've always felt like, and I'm sure many of you do as well, that it's unfortunate that we have to address issues like consent, sexual decision-making, sexual violence, or even pornography. We don't get to do that until students hit the college campus, but I found that in my work, specifically out here, people have been pretty open to it, and largely open to it because no one's having, or I shouldn't say no one, a lot of people are not having conversations around this in any kind of formal way. So this gives students and listeners the opportunity to have these conversations and ask the difficult questions. So I haven't had really any institutional blowback because of the perspective I'm taking. So I've been fortunate in that. I'll wait for it to happen. I'm sure it will. But where I am at right now, people have been pretty open.
Oh, that's great. Yes. Yeah, that's so important.
In fact, I was just invited to speak at University of Idaho, which many people don't remember that Idaho exists as a state, but I just got invited to speak there at University of Idaho with about 600 incoming Greek students. And Idaho tends to be a bit more conservative, but the student affairs staff within their university was very focused on the idea that we need to have conversations around this because they know how impactful it is. So it's been, even in conservative areas, there's been a willingness, and I think that you all will find that too.
God, that is so great.
Yeah.
So the next question that we have is, do you have any suggestions for appropriate education for middle school boys, like 11 to 13?
That's where it gets more difficult, right? Because we got to make sure that all the conversations are age appropriate. I think the best advice is try to couch the information that you're giving them around this topic within a more comprehensive sexual education program and conversations around consent and sexual decision making. My best advice in terms of young people in particular is to eliminate shame around this. There's certainly a natural curiosity around these issues to explore these topics, but they got to be age appropriate. My other advice would be, and of course this doesn't necessarily have to do with 13 and 14-year-olds, but maybe even earlier on, but you could touch on it with this group as well, is beginning conversations about consent really, really early, and doing so even outside the scope of actual sex, right? Like I've heard or had good conversations with people around messaging consent to even 5, 6, 7-year-olds, so talking to them about the fact that if they don't want to hug grandma, they don't have to hug grandma, right? Like they have the bodily autonomy to make those decisions. So practicing that in real life and then mirroring that behavior for them, and then when they hit, their teenage years, trying to have those age-appropriate conversations where we talk about pornography as certainly something that's freely available, but making sure we note that it's highly performative and sex is experienced in a multitude of ways, and it's not necessarily what we would see, in this content, that they have the opportunity to learn about healthy sexuality early on and in a sex-positive way. So that's my best advice, age-appropriate, coupled with some sort of sex education program, and then definitely entrenched in conversations about consent and sexual decision-making more broadly.
Great, yeah. And that was actually along the lines of a question that I had myself. So that one was really useful. Not that they aren't all, but...
No, but that's particularly, it's a difficult question to answer, and it's a difficult conversation to navigate. And I especially find that with parents who will come up to me after presentations, A, horrified, and B, wondering how they broached this conversation because they just didn't know that it was so prevalent, right? And we got to admit to ourselves it's hard to have this conversation, but try to make it, as palpable as possible given the person or the individual's age and, comfort level with the topic.
Yeah. So the last question that we have here, looks like, at this point at least, is a prevention educator got this question from a high school student and said she didn't have an answer for it, so she's passing it along to you. Why is pornography legal when it is an actor being paid to have sex? Wouldn't that be considered prostitution? And I don't know if that's necessarily in your research, but maybe you can take a crack at it.
Yeah, that's not in my research, and there have certainly been some feminist scholars that have likened the idea of the pornography industry being, it's sex work, right? It's akin to sex work, but not in the traditional sense, because we may not be having physical contact, with the performers who are depicted in pornography. But if the person asking that question could shoot me an email later, I can find, there's this particular study that I read in my giant binder of pornographic research that I can direct that individual to that talks about that exact conversation and from a feminist lens, like viewing the porn industry as a form of prostitution, as this buying and selling sexuality. So I can't answer that adeptly right now, but if you shoot me an email, I can totally get you that, that document and get you well on your way. And I think that highlights how difficult the conversations can be had within the moment, and how you will get questions that will throw you through a loop, especially with young people, that you'll have to, go out there and think on, and then you'll be more prepared for the next time around. But yeah, I will get you that document to show you how to answer that question more depthly.
Great, yeah, and we'll make sure to send a message to that person and let them know that they can reach out to you about that. We have one more, actually. Okay. What do you think that the data on Pornhub's themes and search terms that you referenced in your slideshow indicate about our culture?
I think it indicates that we are, A, more likely to search out the content, and for Pornhub in particular, they're more likely to be boastful about how many people are visiting. Like, it's becoming so normalized that they're able to curate and really adeptly delineate data to those who are seeking that out. And I encourage the person who asked you this question to actually go to Pornhub Insights, because you'll see this almost bragging sort of theme throughout some of the articles they post on their data, wherein they're, they actually in the couple of pieces on incest pornography that they talk about in Pornhub Insights, where they talk about Mother's Day and Father's Day and the uptick in searches, there's almost like a nonchalance with which this stuff is talked about, and I think that speaks to, a greater permeation of a culture that has normalized this sort of content and the acts depicted therein. So I would encourage you to go there. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So I think we're about ready to wrap up now, unless it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. So again, Amber, I want to thank you so much for presenting. We are getting feedback in the questions about this being the best webinar. So,
I hope I get some
all the credit to you for that.
Awesome.
And then real quick before we log off, we're just going to switch back over to our screen just because I wanted to pull up Jesse's contact information. Just to remind everyone that if they have any feedback on this webinar or on the the Summer Prevention Series in general, to just shoot Jesse an email there at your convenience. And thank you all so much for attending, and thank you again, Amber, for presenting.
Oh, no worries.